Τώρα θα ζητήσω από την κυρία Κάθριν Μπάρναρντ του Πανεπιστημίου του Κέμπριτζ, την καθηγήτρια στο Πανεπιστημίου του Κέμπριτζ, να μας μιλήσει για τις δικές της αναλύσεις όσον αφορά την οδηγία, αλλά και τις επεξεργασίες που έχουν γίνει στα πλαίσια του Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation to welcome me here in Athens. Thank you in particular for laying on some very fine weather. I left snow and rain and 1 degree in London, and it's a great relief to see that Greece, the sun is shining in Greece, at least in some respects. I'm going to be talking about the UK's implementation of the Services Directive. I'm conscious that I'm going to sound extremely patriotic and nationalistic. That is not usually my way, but in this respect, the United Kingdom has actually been a good boy in Europe. And we have embraced the Services Directive with alacrity and enthusiasm. It was a measure which was adopted under the Labour government, a government which has been associated with a strong deregulatory agenda, and indeed the Services Directive has very much played to the deregulatory agenda advocated by the Labour government and now pursued by the coalition. So the UK has always been an enthusiastic supporter of the Services Directive, and that is explained in part by the importance of services in the UK economy. Counts for about 75% of GDP, and so of course the UK is keen to further the provision of services. It must be said, however, that we have a very different cultural tradition from continental Europe. We do not tightly control all aspects of service regulation in a way that is done in countries such as your own. Our argument is that the market will determine quality, and because the market will determine quality, therefore you do not need tight regulation, except in respect of regulated professions and certain professions like gas fitters, which of course raise issues of public safety. And to give you an example of this, I want to tell you about hairdressers. In the United Kingdom, anyone can set themselves up as a hairdresser. In Germany, you can only set yourself up as a hairdresser once you have been authorised, regulated, been through all sorts of training in order to get that regulation. Now, the British mentality is anyone can set themselves up as a hairdresser, and if I'm a bad hairdresser, I will not get repeat customers. You don't need the state to intervene because it's not going to kill the customer if they get a bad haircut. They will just tell their friends that they've had a terrible haircut and the hairdresser will go out of business. In the German eyes, these things need to be regulated to protect the consumer from having a bad haircut. The upside of the German model is that you will be guaranteed to get a good haircut, but there will be fewer providers on the market, and thus the cost of the haircut will be greater. The British approach, by contrast, is that lots more hairdressers can come onto the market. The risk is that you as the customer will get a bad haircut, but at the end of the day that's not going to kill you, and because the hairdresser is not regulated by the state, the hairdresser will go out of business. And so our philosophy in areas which are not regulated professions is that the market will prevail. That said, although the UK government has been in favour of the directive, the trade unions were not necessarily very much in favour of the directive. And what you have on this slide is a postcard to the then Prime Minister Tony Blair by one of the largest trade unions then, a trade union called Amicus. And Amicus said, stop the Valentine's pay massacre, a pun on Valentine's Day, Valentine's Pay. This campaign was launched on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February. And the argument was that this directive is going to undermine terms and conditions of employment in the United Kingdom. Now, you might think that we don't have many terms and conditions of employment, but we do have some, and there was concern on the part of the trade union movement. But actually, the discussion has somewhat died a death amongst trade unions. They're less concerned about the Services Directive than they are about the Posted Workers Directive. And so I'm not going to say more about the trade union concerns. The government, however, has really emphasised the benefits of implementing the Services Directive properly. And on this slide, I've summarised some of the points for you. But the estimation is that there will be an increase in the number of jobs by 81,000 and possibly welfare increases of somewhere between 1 million and 2.6 billion. Now, of course, in a time of recession, these figures may well be reconsidered, but nevertheless, from the UK government's point of view, the directive is a good thing. So how did we set about implementing the directive? We set about implementing the directive with vigour and enthusiasm. We took it very seriously. We had a good team of young, enthusiastic lawyers, and the government devoted a lot of resources to the process of implementation. And this diagram summarises the approach that the UK adopted to actually implementing the directive, with a timeline starting in December 2006, the date envisaged by the directive when new measures should not be introduced unless justified, and ending up in essentially 2000 and end of 2009, start of 2010, when the directive had to be implemented. And what I want you to note is that you will see the emphasis in this diagram on the technical aspects, setting up a point of single contact, PSC, and then in addition the heavy emphasis on pre-screening, i.e. screening of legislation prior to the deadline, significant emphasis on consultation, a point I will return to, and then the consultation leading up to the adoption of the bill and ultimately what actually became the regulations implementing the directive in a framework way. Now I'm going to look at a couple of the key aspects of our implementation process which I thought might be of interest for you. And the first point, it concerns the legislative screening, which is in green on the diagram. Now, as far as legislative screening is concerned, this is the idea where the government trawled through all of the existing legislation to check for its compatibility with the Services Directive. And this was taken immensely seriously. A huge amount of resource was devoted to this screening process. The resource was coordinated by the old Department of Trade and Industry, which now goes by the rather trendy acronym BIS, Business, the Department for Business. And they coordinated the screening of all national legislation, which would be both Acts of Parliament, the primary law, and also secondary instruments, the secondary law. But of course that wasn't enough, because as in all systems, we have national level legislation, but an awful lot of authorisations are done at local level by local authorities. And so there was coordination between central government and local government, with a lot of support given by central government to get local authorities to screen all of their local rules for compatibility with the directive. In addition, we also have devolved administrations, so that's Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and they also had to engage in the process of screening the legislation for which they have competence.